Dr. Rivers said that he really was, what he was doing was much more important than being a medical doctor in the armed forces. And so he remained here. But he was drafted into the Army. And when he told Rivers that, Rivers immediately got on the phone, called somebody in Washington, and all of a sudden he was made a Naval Reserve officer. And so he spent the entire war period in uniform as a Naval Reserve officer, which was the same as all of the postdoctoral fellows. They were all Naval Reserve officers. One of them was Lewis Thomas, who later became a very famous writer and so on, who was a colleague of Mac's then, and they were close friends. And on the Naval Reserve, all the doctors got a monthly exam that they were supposed to fill out and send in, and just to make sure that they were doing something. The only one who never filled out one of those papers was Lou Thomas. And he got the same promotions and the same everything that the others got, just that he never filled out the test. But that was Lou Thomas, so he did it his way. And he was able to get through. So the whole time or almost the whole time, that Mac was working on the DNA project with Avery, he was in naval unit, in naval uniform, and he was in the Navy. And actually, being in the Navy as a captain or whatever rank he had there, lieutenant, I don't know, he earned more than he had ever earned before with his fellowships and so on. He did have a few mentors, one from Hopkins, who was the head of pediatrics, where Mac had done his residency at Johns Hopkins, who 3 times invited him to come back to Hopkins as the chief resident in pediatrics, but always saying he understood that Mac really wanted to do research and he wasn't trying to push him. But just in case he ever got dissatisfied with that and wanted to come back, they would love to have him. So he was invited 3 times to come back as chief resident, but he never did it. He was on the Armed Forces Epidemiological Board from during the war, and he continued to give service on that. In addition to that, he did a lot of public service things, which should be noted. For example, he was on the Public Research Institute board from 1983 to 1990. No, from 1957 for 41 years. And he was chairman of that for many of those years. He was president of the New York Heart Association and on their board for a long time because that was part of his work. And when the Helen Hay Whitney Foundation was started, they set up a scientific advisory committee, and Walter Bauer from Massachusetts General and Harvard was the chairman. But he immediately got sick, and Mac became the acting chairman he didn't have a title or anything, but he took over, and he really built that foundation up. And it still is one of the most prestigious postdoctoral funding sources in the country. And he remained on that when Walter Bauer died, he officially became the chairman and was still on that until he was past 85 and thought that maybe it was time to let somebody else do it. But he loved that, and he loved the meeting that they had every year with the fellows, and the idea of the young people mingling with the scientific advisory committee and having a meeting together to which no outsiders were allowed, no wives, no girlfriends, no boyfriends, nobody. I was allowed to come, by then I was his wife, and I was allowed to come on the first night of the meeting where they had a dinner get-together here at Rockefeller. And the only reason I was allowed to come was so I could give out the name tags to the fellows. But I did have dinner with them. There were 5 or 6 scientists on the Helen Hay Whitney board. And he made the assignments of who interviewed which students. You know, he looked at all of the applications and decided who was the appropriate person to interview. And they did very well for many, many years. The only thing that he did that paid him any money other than his salary or the little bit that he got from the Whitney Foundation, which he never wanted to take more because he felt that it was better to give it to the fellows. Fred Seitz was a good friend of the head of Reynolds, who had been the president here, the chairman of the board here at Rockefeller. And when he retired from the board here, he set up a fund that Reynolds was going to contribute to work on science or medical research that had nothing to do with cigarettes or cancer, or they couldn't be involved in anything that Reynolds would be prejudiced by. And Fred asked Mac and Jim Shannon, who had been the head of the NIH, to join him on that committee. And they set up this fund, and then they went around to various and sundry places that were interested in having some of their people funded. And one of the early people that they funded was Stan Prusner, who ultimately won the Nobel Prize for the work he did under the Reynolds. And it was Mac who, Fred certainly was not a medical doctor. And when Fred said, well, what do you think of that? And Mac said, I think it's terrific, and I think we should fund it. And so they funded him. And because of that, because they funded it for years, he and Fred and I were all invited to the Nobel party. And all these other things that he did were really pro bono. His earlier people who were mentors to him, there was one from Hopkins who was the head of pediatrics there, and that was Edwards Park. He was the one who kept inviting Mac back to come and be chief president, but didn't want to push him because he knew what Mac wanted to do. And at Hopkins, when Mac was a medical student there, they had no exams, they had no grades in anything. And the only way he knew, at the end of 2 years, the first 2 years of medical school, they had to take an examination of the 2 years' work that they had done. And the only way that he ever realized that he'd done well was when it came to nominating students for the Medical Honorary Society. And if there was somebody sitting there with, because they kept grades, but the students never saw them. And Max said he knew he'd done well because he was okayed for nomination to the Honor Society, so he figured that must have been all right. But other than that, they never had any inkling whether they were good, bad, or indifferent. And this was all during the Depression, so it was hard for a lot of the students who didn't have the kind of support that he had from his parents to just, keep going. So Ned Park and the other person who was a mentor of his was William Tillett at NYU, who gave him his first chance at research when he was still a resident at Hopkins. And Park had told Tillett that this was a good boy, And Tillett recommended that he apply for, he had $100 a month from some financier in New York that was supporting this. So he was able to pay Mac $100 a month, which of course, he had at that time he had a wife and 2 children, and, luckily his parents were in a position to and were willing to support him. So Tillett said that he would suggest that he apply for a National Research Council fellowship, that was the only fellowship that was available at that time for medical research. And he got a letter from the board there saying that they would accept him for a fellowship, but they thought he should broaden his horizons and go to Rockefeller to work with Colin McLeod. And what they didn't know, that Bill Tillett knew, was that Colin McLeod was just going down to NYU to be the professor of bacteriology. And so they never worked together, but they knew each other well. And it was interesting that they crossed paths and Tillett knew that Colin was going down there. And he called Avery and said, "You want somebody in your lab to replace Colin?" And Avery said, "Sure." So that's how he got to work with Avery. And with his biochemical background, because he had majored in biochemistry at Stanford, and then he had more biochemistry at Hopkins. And because of that, he really was very useful on the team. As far as his personal interest outside of science, he was a big-time Dickens fan, and he would read and reread Dickens all the time. He would read something, but he'd also have a Dickens book in his hand, just in case if he didn't like what he was reading, he could go to Dickens. He liked the theater. He liked the Philharmonic. And he liked meeting with friends and having a good time too. He did enjoy that. Well, his oldest son died very early, before Mac did. There was a congenital heart condition that ran through his family. And his father died early from that. And his 2 brothers one died very early from that. Mac had it, but he was lucky. When he had it, they had a very good cardiologist at New York Hospital who did a triple bypass, and Mac lived for another 30 years. But his father died very young, and his oldest son also, who refused to go to a doctor. He was a physical chemist at Hopkins, and he never went to a doctor, and he died very young. His youngest son, also, who had gone through cancer chemotherapy at age 21, and really didn't, with a lot of surgery involved and so on. And he really didn't like going to doctors. And so he also died very young. His daughter is still alive and well, and she lives in Florida. And his middle son lives in Baltimore. He had been a professor of biochemistry at Cornell, and then he moved to Hopkins. After 25 years at Cornell, he moved to Hopkins, where he had done his undergraduate and graduate studies. And he's still in that area. He's emeritus from Hopkins. He became the dean of the School of Arts and Sciences, and had a very good career. And he had one thing that was exceptional. When he was the dean of Arts and Sciences, he managed to convince them that his father should have an honorary degree from Hopkins, since he had been there and several of his children, and then he has a granddaughter who was a Hopkins graduate. And so they arranged for him to have an honorary degree. And his son Dick presented the degree, and he went through all of the things that his father did and was, and so on and so forth. And he ended up with, "and my father." And of course the audience just went wild. So he was very proud of that. And that son is still alive.